Central to our understanding of competitive dynamics is this notion of the competitive life cycle. Industry after industry, you can observe the following phases. An emergent phase when a technology first comes about, followed by a growth phase as the technology is more widely adopted, and then finally a mature phase where growth and sales begin to decline, and we end in a more mature phase of competition. The easiest way to illustrate this is what we think of in terms of cumulative revenues. We often see this S-shaped curve for cumulative revenues over time. So go back to the automobile industry once again. Early on, we see slow adoption as others are trying to figure out this technology, as consumers are getting comfortable with it. Eventually, we see a large growth phase as the automobile becomes widely adopted in society. And then eventually, growth begins to decline as we enter a more mature phase, markets become saturated, and the like. This repeats itself in industry after industry. More recently, we can see this in the market for iPods and the market for digital music players with Apple and other competitors. There's an earlier phase, especially in the late 1990s. A number of products are offered on the market. Eventually, we see what we call an annealing process, where there is basically a dominant design that emerges within the industry. And once that occurs, this is often the point at which we see the growth phase begin. So if we think about the digital music player market again, we have an earlier stage with entry by companies like Rio, Dell, even Microsoft. Eventually we have Apple enter the industry with their iPod, and that in of itself tends to cause an annealing process where there becomes agreement on what a digital music player really should look like. We see a large growth phase, and arguably we're entering now into a mature phase where the growth in sales are beginning to decline, and we're seeing a more stable competitive ordering within the industry. So let's talk a little bit more about that competitive ordering. An interesting empirical observation across many industries, if not all industries, is what we call a shakeout in the number of firms within an industry. Early on, we have entry come into an industry, a new technology, a new market emerges. And as those firms begin to enter, we have the growth phase, and this causes even a greater rush to enter into what now seems to be a burgeoning and attractive market. Often, we then get basically over capacity within the industry, too many firms competing within that space, and what we call a shakeout occurs. Firms go out of business, mergers and acquisitions occur, and we end up with a lower number of firms that stabilize within the industry. So annealing as a process by which designs start to coalesce around a common understanding of what a product or service would look like, leading to a growth phase, and then a shakeout that occurs competitively that shapes the number of firms within an industry. And then finally, we often have a disruption that starts the whole process again. And this is the whole idea of a life cycle here, the circle of life, if you will, that over time we will eventually get a disruption which restarts this whole process. Final thing we want to think about are margins. So how do margins evolve over time? Well, this one I put a question mark next to because there's more variability in this across different industries. It isn't uncommon to see the following scenario where early on firms are not very profitable in the industry, maybe in fact losing money in the industry, but as they begin to figure out the technology, begin to figure out the business model, we have then this annealing process. We start to see growth in demand. This is going to cause margins to improve, but however, we get this competitive entry that makes margins more difficult to maintain. We get this shakeout, and then we solidify around perhaps some stable profitability within the industry. Where that level of profitability is depends on many of the characteristics we talked about around the 5 forces in industry structure. So some industries like airlines tend to have very low margins. Others like pharmaceuticals tend to have fairly high average margins within industry. So let me share with you some data here to illustrate this notion of a competitive life cycle, and in particular this shakeout phenomenon among firms. So here we see some data from Dobrov et al. Looking at automobiles both in the US, Great Britain, Germany, and France. What we see here is a density graph here, so basically the number of competitors at any point in time over time. You can see that in the turn of last century, around 1905 or so, there were close to 400 different automobile manufacturers in the United States. This was also found in Great Britain, Germany, and France. Over time, we have a shakeout that occurs starting in the 1915 or so range and then proceeding until the mid-20s. And then we have a period of relative stability here with a fewer number of automobile companies competing with one another. In the US, for a number of years, we've had the big three US auto manufacturers in Chrysler, General Motors, and Ford. It's interesting to note that at the end of the graph, you start to see an uptick in the number of U.S. Competing companies, and this probably is due to the entry of foreign companies into the U.S. market, particularly from Asia, first from Japan, Toyota and Honda, and then eventually from Korea. Here we see data from Carroll et al. Looking at the beer industry. On the left side, we see the German brewing industry, and then on the right side, we see the U.S. brewing industry. We have changes in technology evolving with the Industrial Revolution that changes the ability to do large batch processing. We see massive entry into both of these sectors, US and Germany, during this time period, and eventually a competitive shakeout that leads to a fewer number of competitors within the industry. It's interesting to note in the US case, we have this dip in here in the 1920s. As many of you might be aware, this is when we had prohibition in the US that outlawed the production of alcohol and beer. And so basically the industry disappeared, at least legally, for a few years before coming back. But it's interesting to note how the dynamics stay the same over that period of time. In the US, we've had a relatively stable situation over the last 30 years or so, where we've had a big three in beer manufacturing, or beer brewing, in Anheuser-Busch, Miller, and Coors. But that's beginning to change quite a bit now that that market has started to go international and globalize with mergers and acquisitions occurring in that space. Final one I'll share with you is from Wade, looking at microprocessors. So this is Intel, chip designers, chip manufacturers. And in this one, we don't quite see the shakeout as pronounced, though that might be because we only go to 1990. If we had extended that out further, we might see the shakeout more pronounced here. But you get the basic idea, again, of this S-curve in terms of the number of competitors within an industry. So what do we observe in general? Well, early on in this emergent phase, it's sometimes referred to as an era of ferment. Firms are being exploratory here. They're trying different types of product designs, different type of value offerings, trying to figure out the market, the technology, the business model for this particular class. Often, to the extent there's much innovation, it's focused on product features, less on process. It's often led by small entrepreneurial firms. We often see them as the first entrants into industries. When we think about the digital music player, for example, Raya was one of the first entries into that market. Many people don't realize that Apple actually was many years late to the game to that marketplace before they came out with the iPod. In terms of competitive positioning, which we'll talk more about in next session, most firms are trying to position themselves as a differentiated player or maybe a niche player within the industry at these early stages. Over time, a dominant design emerges. This is the idea, again, that there's a coalescing on what basically a product or service in this class will look like. Take the automobile. Early on in the history of the automobile, there were many different competing technologies for the horseless carriage. There was, of course, the gasoline-powered internal combustion engine, which it came to dominate, but there was also electric vehicles, there were kerosene-based vehicles, there was the old Stanley steamer, a steam-based engine car. So over time, as they're competing on these different types of designs, there's often this process of a single or at least a handful of designs that emerge out of that process that become kind of standard within the industry. More recently, you can think about the market for smartphones, where there's many different competing designs, but then the Apple iPhone, in essence, defined the market, and now we find that most smartphones coming out more or less have the similar type of look and feel as to what the iPhone pioneered. As this dominant design emerges, we often see a shift in the innovation process from product to more process delivery service, other value-added services in the ecosystem. It's often the case because of the shakeout that we see just a few very large, efficient firms remaining within the industry. And it's not always the case, but it is often the case that pioneering firms often wither away. Take, once again, Ryo in the digital music player market. Eventually, this whole process repeats itself. Eventually, there will be some new technology, some new market opportunity that shifts the market yet again. Now, this might be due to what we call technology push, an exogenous technological change. And it's easy to think of examples of this. Once again, in the automobile industry or the carriage industry, we had the evolution of this new technology and engine technology that drove that industry. In a previous session, I talked about Swiss watchmakers who had wind-up, spring-loaded watches, and then we had the advent of digital technology reinventing that industry. What you see here in the graph is what we call the technology S-curve, similar to the revenue S-curve we showed before, but with some slight differences here. Here we're looking not at revenues, but technical performance on any dimension that you might think. And maybe it's the speed of a microprocessor or the energy efficiency of a gasoline engine. We often see a similar dynamic here that as you put more effort into trying to devise a better technology, we at first are spending a lot of time and not getting much advantages in terms of our technical performance. But eventually we kind of figure things out and we see this massive increase in technical performance, but then we start to mine the field and it becomes harder and harder to get subsequent improvements in that technology. If we think about the internal combustion engine, there has been now over 100 years of work refining, improving that technology, and so we don't see dramatic improvements in gasoline-powered internal combustion engines at this point in time. Other technologies, such as hydrogen fuel cells, have the potential to have the beginnings of this S-curve take place and maybe see massive improvements if we continue to put efforts into those technologies. Now, ultimately, there might be some physical limit that limits the technical performance of a technology. It's at that point in time that we often see other alternative approaches start to emerge. People have talked about in the microprocessor industry, silicon-based microprocessors, pioneered by Intel and others, are arguably reaching a fundamental limit to how well they can work and how small they can get based on physical limits of the technology. And it suggests that perhaps there'll be some alternative way of designing microprocessors and building microprocessors in the near future that will get us over these technological limits. Now, technology is an important chart, but it is not the only way to think about this. There's also sometimes just simply shifts in market demand, what we call demand pull, that can drive a disruption. Think about Walmart, or actually let's think about a big box retailer like Best Buy. This is arguably an innovation that has shifted markets here, where historically we might have smaller retailers, maybe located on a downtown area or perhaps at a mall. We now have these big box retailers with volume and scale unforeseen before. They operate out of more suburban locations. This was, in essence, a shift in customer preferences, maybe based on demographic changes, that led to a disruption and a change in the marketplace, where maybe there was some technology underneath it, especially around information technology. But by and large, it was driven more by the demand side than the technology side. Once we have this disruption, we have this process renew again, and we have this emergent typically of a new dominant design. Some interesting things to observe. First, new technologies may actually be worse at first on dominant areas of performance that we're interested in. It may very well be that, let's say, electric vehicles do not have the energy efficiency, do not have the miles per gallon, not miles per gallon, cost that you would see in an internal combustion engine. And that's clearly the case right now. But on other dimensions of merit, maybe ability to speed up, of course, miles per gallon, it does surpass the other technology. And so as they start to improve, you start to see this substitution process between the old technology and the new technology. Now, not all new technologies work out. Some come along, fail to improve fast enough, and then thus eventually disappear. But for those who do succeed, we see these overlapping S-curves take place over time. So once again, technology is evolving, it's maturing, and as it matures, we suddenly see entry of a competing technology or competing business model. That eventually improves to a point that it supplants the existing technology, and so on and so on. What's interesting about this is this notion of a competitive reordering. And it's often the case that older firms do not adapt to this renewal process we see in the industry and are therefore driven from the market.